Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you how to make this responsive multi-column grid layout that doesn't need media queries. Now this website here has a grid parent div and it contains multiple child divs for each of these cards on the website. Now there are a lot of existing styles that I already added just for the UI design here, but if we go down all the way to the bottom, we have a grid layout and we just have a gap of 20 pixels of space added between each of the cards. And right now, everything is in one column, no matter what the viewport width is. But we want this layout to have 2, 3, and 4 columns as the viewport width gets wider. Now, if we wanted to use the traditional approach using media queries, we could add a media query for progressively larger widths, so 40 rems, which is 640 pixels, and we could change our grid template columns to have 2 columns, and then we can duplicate that for 50 rems. We could have 3 columns, which is 800 pixels, and then for 60 rems, which is 960 pixels, we could have 4 columns. So now when the viewport width increases, we go to 3 and then 4 columns. And then down to 1. And this does work perfectly fine, but with CSS Grid, we can do all of this dynamically without media queries. And we do this by using autofit and the minmax and min functions. So let me show you how this works. So I'm going to delete all the media queries, and we are going to add grid template columns and then the repeat function. And normally you'd put in a static number like 2 for the number of columns and then 1fr for the column size to make 2 columns of equal width. But to make our grid dynamic, instead of setting a static column size like 2, we can instead set this to auto fit. Autofit lets the browser dynamically choose how many columns can fit in the available width. However, if we just leave the column size as is at 1fr, we're only going to have 1 column no matter what. Now, what we could do is, instead of 1fr, we could set this to a static number like 250 pixels, and then the browser will add more columns in the grid when there's enough space available to fill them. You can see that it is creating more columns. However, there is this gap when there's not quite enough space to add that next 250 pixel column. And ideally, we would want the columns to be able to grow in size in order to fill everything. But we can do this with a special function called minmax. And minmax can only be used in grid. It can't be used just anywhere in CSS. So instead of 250 static size, we set the size to min-max. And in min-max, we set a minimum size that we want the columns to be, like 250, then a comma, and then we can set the maximum size, which is usually 1fr, and this way the columns can now grow to fit the available space. So now you can see at smaller widths we have 1 column, then we grow to 2, and you can see it's kind of seamlessly growing instead of having that extra space. Now the only possible hiccup with this is that if you have a very small viewport where there's less than 250 pixels of space for the columns, let me show you this with responsive design mode. So when I get down below that 250 pixel minimum width, you can see that the content's starting to overflow and we have horizontal scrolling, which is never a good thing. Now, even though this is kind of an edge case, I do think it's always good to fix them before they happen. And we can actually do this with the min function. Now, the min function is a general CSS function that you can use anywhere in your styles, unlike minmax, which is limited to just grid. And here we can use the min function to make the minimum value in our minmax function more dynamic. So in the min function, it's going to take 2 values separated by a comma, and it's going to choose whichever value is the smallest number, and that's going to be the final value. So I'm going to set one value to 100%, comma, and then set the second one to 250 pixels. So now when we save, keep an eye on the website here, And you can see that at these smaller viewport widths, the columns are now able to shrink less than 250 pixels because at these really narrow viewport widths, the 100% is going to be less than 250. Another thing that you want to do is for accessibility, you want to make sure to use rems instead of pixels for the column sizes. So right now we're using 250 pixels for our column size. However, let me show you what happens if you go into your browser settings and you change your browser base font size from the default of 16 pixels to something a lot bigger, like 32 pixels. So if we go back to the website and reload, you can see that, let me just zoom out a bit here, there's this kind of weird overflow happening, and this is because the text, which I've always set in rems for my font sizes because it's more accessible, the text gets bigger as the browser font size scales up, but the size of the cards stays the same. So things get really narrow in your columns. So what we want to do is we want to convert the 250 pixels to rems. We can do that by 250, and you divide it by 16 because there's 16 pixels in one rem by default, and we get 15.625. So let's copy that. Then we'll replace the 250 pixels with 15.625 rems. So now when we save, keep an eye on the website again. Now the column sizes are allowed to scale up, so they're actually getting wider at the given viewport width than they were before. And this is actually what you want, because you want the cards to scale up in width along with the font sizes. And one more thing to keep in mind is how grid behaves when you compare it to Flexbox. So with grid, when we have incomplete rows like we have here, you're going to have empty spots in the grid because the grid template is strict. So all the columns are going to be the same size in every row. However, we can build a similar dynamic grid layout with Flexbox. So I have the Flexbox version here, and the Flexbox is using these styles. So we can build this by setting FlexWrap to wrap, and then we're sizing the Flex children to have a Flex basis size of 250 pixels, which I converted to rems again. And then Flex Grow is set to 1 to allow the Flex child items, which are the cards, to grow to fit the available space. Now with Flexbox, there is no strict grid template. Flexbox, as you can see, is more flexible, and the Flex children on each row are allowed to be different widths in order to fit. So we don't have the same column width on every single row. We can be a little bit more flexible and basically break the template like you can't do with grid. So if you want all of your Flex children to fill the available space, even if it means breaking the template, then you might want to use Flexbox. But if you want that strict grid template where all the columns are going to be the same size and then you have empty spots in the grid, then you should use CSS Grid. And that's how you can make a dynamically responsive grid. Let me know down in the comments what you thought, and you can find the source code for these website demos linked below as well. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.